The satellite is one of the most advanced pieces of technology that has ever been created by mankind. The ability to launch an unmanned craft into space has provided countless benefits for nations worldwide.
Satellites are a critical part of the global communications network. Whether you know it or not, about 365 satellites are ringing the Earth now, providing voice, video, and data.
In the United States, commercially owned spacecraft account for more than 80% of government satellite needs.
The one area where the U.S. continues to have great success is in commercial space. There are many companies in this country that are operating satellites commercially, providing services to the U.S. government at very affordable costs, at extremely high quality. And it seems to me that it's very much in the interest of the United States government to continue to foster that capability, perpetuate their industrial base, and keep the capability within this country, but also to have it available for soldiers and sailors and to provide for the nation's security, as is happening across so much of the world.
The U.S. government over the last number of years has sort of been a pioneer in technology development with things like the Predator drones. And those kinds of systems just require an enormous amount of bandwidth. At the same time, the U.S. government can't necessarily afford to buy all the satellites they need to support all of these different systems. So it's really up to the commercial industry to rise to the challenge, because the reality is that we're highly dependent on these systems, and we really can't operate on today's modern battlefield without satellite capacity to support the systems.
SES Government Solutions is fully devoted to providing the United States government with the most advanced and comprehensive satellite services available.
SES Government Solutions has only one mission, and that's to support the satellite communication needs of the U.S. government. And we're really in a couple of different businesses. One of them is just providing satellite capacity, or what we call bandwidth, to support government networks. But we're also in the business of designing, building, and operating networks on behalf of the government. We understand what the government needs, and we understand it from the government's perspective.
Today, SES Government Solutions maintains the second largest fleet of satellites in the world.
The antennas right here behind me are used to fly and communicate with the 49 satellites that we have in our fleet.
SES is undergoing a very aggressive fleet expansion program right now. In fact, we had in one single quarter this year 4 satellite launches. And we're also going to increase capacity by a similar amount over the coming years, with 7 additional launches scheduled between 2012 and 2014.
The SES fleet is able to provide a number of services for the United States government. On September 21, 2011, the U.S. Air Force hitched a ride on the SES-2 satellite.
CHIRP was a Pathfinder program. It stands for Commercially Hosted Infrared Payload. And what the payload is a heat-sensitive device that's mounted on our commercial spacecraft. And it operates in the infrared frequency range. And these sorts of devices are useful for a variety of purposes, everything from missile launch detection to location of forest fires, for example. The unique thing about CHIRP is it's a new generation of sensor. It's smaller than previous generations. It's also more sensitive. Because it's small enough to mount on a commercial spacecraft, we were able to add it to a planned program as what we call a hosted payload. And for the very first time, we'll have an infrared system, a small new generation infrared system operating from geosynchronous orbit, which is much further from the Earth than we've typically been able to operate infrared payloads. The Air Force estimated that they spent only about 15% as much as they would have had to spend to put it on one of their own spacecraft. And that's a pretty compelling economic argument. We think there are going to be a lot more opportunities to do things like CHIRP.
The Air Force CHIRP is the most recent example of how the SES fleet can save the U.S. government a tremendous amount of time and resources.
The hosted payload concept includes adding a sensor, a communications package, or some functional instrument on someone else's satellite. The interest in this piggybacking approach is to leverage the experience that the commercial satellite sector has in getting to orbit quickly and cost effectively. Also, because the satellite sector gets to orbit relatively quickly, there's a pretty frequent cadence of satellite launches from the commercial side during the course of the year. This allows the government to deploy technologies pretty rapidly, and each one of these launched hosted payloads then paves the way for a more robust and regular collaboration on hosted payloads between the government stakeholders and the commercial satellite sector.
In addition to providing hosted payload services, government organizations can also lease bandwidth from the SES fleet.
Transponded capacity on a satellite is commonly referred to as bandwidth by the commercial and government community. So there's going to be a need for a commercial broadcaster to lease bandwidth on our satellite, commonly called for an event or something like that, occasional use, leasing.
Arguments that favor leasing the capacity or leasing the capability from a company like SES significantly has to do with cost. If the United States government is to build a satellite, they inherit all of the risk in the development, and of course they inherit the responsibility to pay for that satellite in its entirety, and when it's on orbit and operating, they pay for that whether it's actually being utilized 24 hours a day or not. Contrast that with a commercial acquisition where the responsibility for all of the developmental risk, all of the costs associated with that are borne by the commercial company. And most importantly, when the satellite is on orbit and if the United States government chooses to use some of that capacity on that satellite, they only pay for what they use.
The need for satellite communications is increasing as soldiers are withdrawn from locations such as Afghanistan and Iraq. Currently, the need for bandwidth outweighs the capacity of satellites in orbit.
When troops move out of the active theater of operations and come back to home, hopefully, or wherever they're deployed, the need for communications in the area does not necessarily decrease. Matter of fact, most of the time it increases. The technology has evolved so much that the capacity that is required to provide full-time video surveillance via many, many different means takes up a ton of bandwidth. That bandwidth will be required for as long as we need to know what's going on in these areas.
As SES looks to the future, uses for its fleet are increasing in exciting new ways.
So we provided capacity and engineering expertise to prove out what types of antennas could be used, for example, on these aircraft, and how was the best way to use transponded capacity to do that. Going forward, we're continuing to expand our capabilities in the theater of operations to provide this reach-back capability for these types of vehicles.
The need for satellite communication services is increasing, and as this need increases, SES Government Solutions will continue to meet the satellite needs of the United States government.
The U.S. government needs the capabilities that we provide, and we come to work every day striving to better understand what they need today, but also what they're going to need tomorrow. And within our organization, we're going to do whatever it takes to make sure that they have the capabilities they need.
For more information, visit www.ses-gs.com or call 703-610-1000.